John chapter 6. When we started this study, the book of John, I told you that John is going to tell us some stories that we did not know in the other Gospels. Stories that his readers needed to hear because they had some misconceptions of Jesus and his ministry. And in John chapter 6, you're going to read a story that everybody knows. And then when you come across this, when you study John, you have to ask yourself, why? I mean, come on, John, we had this story in the other three Gospels. Why put this one in here? So we're looking at an old story, but it's integral to what John wants to teach us in his Gospel. So let's see if we can notice some differences. In John chapter 6, and I'm going to get my glasses on any second here. Verse 1. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. Now, we noticed that aside from the man at the pool, we haven't had much references to him healing somebody. He healed the royal official servant without even being there. No, his son without even being here. But we haven't had a list of all of the people he's healed. But these people have found this out at this point. They've heard of it, and they're following him. He says that, verse 3, Then Jesus went up on the hillside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near, so we know it's in the spring. When Jesus looked up and he saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? Now, this is something we would deal with all the time with disciples, right? I mean, do we go to Winn-Dixie or do we go Publix? So, I mean, where do we go? Do we go to Sam's? There's something we have at Sam's. You know, we get it cheaper here. Where do we buy food for these people to eat? Well, you know that wasn't the situation there. But the text says he asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Now there's a part of the story that we haven't heard before. That he specifically asked Philip, Hey Philip, where are we going to get bread for these people? And John tells us that it was a test for Philip. That's interesting. Let's go ahead and read on. It says, Philip answered, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Now there's somebody who can do some math. Okay? I mean, he could have said a year. He could have said 9 months. But this guy's mind is already going and going, okay, let's see if man, that's some... 8 months wouldn't even get you a bite for everybody. Yeah. He says, another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will that go among so many? Now we know from other stories that this possibly is Mark, the boy with the loaves and the fishes. Okay? Whose mom had enough sense to send him in the wilderness with food. Because moms are good at that. Right? It says, Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place. It's something that John remembers when he remembers it. And that's not always common in this area of Palestine. He said, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. And when they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. Okay. Heard the story before, right? Has some of the shock worn off? Yeah, it has. I mean, the first time you heard it and said, must have been big loaves. Really big fish, like some of the fish that the fishermen around here catch. Right? You know, fishermen, you know, the fish, I mean, No, No. You see pictures, you know, like the one on the front of the order. Yeah, it's just little loaves and little fish. And you realize, okay, wow, this is a miracle. That's amazing. That is an amazing miracle. It had nothing to do with healing anybody. It had to do with basically producing substance where there was no substance before, which God has done in the past, hasn't he? Back in Genesis chapter 1. Okay. An incredible miracle. We just kind of, okay, yeah, it was a nice miracle. It fed 5,000. And men. And we noticed that, you know, there were probably women, and we know there's one child there, right? At least one. There were probably more children there. So there might have been more than 5,000, but they had a tendency to count the men. And we've asked ourselves, as we read Mark, what are 5,000 men doing in the wilderness? And we talked about how that resembles an army. Right? We know this story. We know this story. We didn't know that Jesus intended to do this from the get-go. We didn't know that there was this little test for Philip. Something that Philip needed to struggle with, to realize this is impossible and to be amazed at what Jesus does. We didn't know that. What's John doing with the story? We're going to see from the rest of this chapter that he's introducing this concept of bread. Because the rest of this chapter is about bread. There are going to be people that follow him from one side of this Sea of Tiberias to the other, looking for him, and Jesus is going to say, I know why you're here. It has to do with bread. And then he's going to talk about himself as bread. We don't get to talk about that until we come across in the text. But this is the background for it. And according to John, this is why Jesus did this particular miracle. He is in charge. And he has in mind what he's going to do. And he is moving somewhere. And John's readers needed to understand that. This wasn't just one of those nice happenstance. He looked around and said, oh yeah, hey, why don't we feed 5,000 people today just for something different? He's going somewhere with this. The interesting point, I think, for us in this next verse, in verse 14, he says, after the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again into the hills by himself. Now, if you put this account together with other accounts, you're going to find out the first thing Jesus did was dismiss his disciples. He got the apostles out of there. And then he went back and he dispersed the crowd. And we've made that point before, okay? You know, if we get 5,000 people together, we pass out things and we want their names, email addresses, and phone numbers. And we tell them to come back next week and bring a friend. Well, Jesus sent all these people home. But John says he knew. He knew that they wanted to come and make him king by force. Now, this whole thing of kingship is something that I love to talk about because it is so foreign to us. Having been the United States of America, a democracy for so many years, we don't know what it means to be king. We don't know what it means to have a king. We don't even know the nuances of how someone becomes a king, right? And we don't know what it would be like to face somebody who has that kind of authority that says, you can die. You're going to die. Wait a minute, I want another opinion. Right? There's got to be somebody else I can talk to about this. No, this is the king. This is the person over whom there is no appeal. That's what a king is. Somebody who is a representative of God, the deities, to them. It was their gods that set up kings. It was Yahweh that set up kings. It was they ruled through the God's power and intervention. That just shorts everything out for us.